What's up, Lake Point? Pastor Michael here to fill you in on the first week of our new series, The Blueprint. This series is an exploration of God's design for humanity. We'll be taking an in-depth look at the first two chapters of Scripture, Genesis 1 and 2, the creation story. And within that story, we're going to look at specifically the verses that talk about us, that talk about humans, God's designs, His intentions, His purposes for us. The reason why is because Genesis 1 and 2 provide a stunning vision of what it looks like to be human. What we see in Scripture is that there is continuity when it comes to God's design for our lives. From in the beginning, when God first created us in a world without sin, to where we find ourselves now, kind of stuck in the messy middle stage, if you were, to where we hope to one day be, living with God in His perfect kingdom for all of eternity. God's design remains the same for our lives. The blueprint doesn't change despite what stage we find ourselves in. And this is exciting because it means that our lives have purpose. When we look at God's blueprint for humanity, we see that God put within the human heart a desire for us to be kings and queens, to rule and reign, and to do so in partnership with Him. His righteous rule, His never-ending love, His ultimate authority. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And the emphasis here isn't on how, it's on who. The emphasis is on how we have an intelligent, intentional designer who created us on purpose and for a purpose. The next 24 verses give us poetic detail how God formed and filled the universe, how He created light and darkness and set the sun and the moon and the stars in their place, how He created the sky above and the waters below and filled them with birds and fish, and how He created the land and placed animals and humans on it. We see in the creation story how for 6 days God was hard at work forming and filling the earth with life. And then at the end of His work week, this is what we read in Genesis chapter 1 verse 30 when He says, "God looked over all that He had made and He saw that it was very good." There's this sense of fulfillment, satisfaction, and accomplishment with what He created. Now, jumping ahead to Genesis chapter 2 verse 2, we read that on the seventh day God had finished His work of creation, so He rested from all of His work. Why would God rest? Well, we read in Scripture that God never gets tired or that He grows weary. So, what's up with that? The reason God is resting is not because he's worn out. Rather, we see that His resting is an act of delight. God is enjoying the fruit of His labor. It's God reflecting on goodness, which I think is cool because it provides us with a kind of a new perspective on rest for our lives. The interesting takeaway that Nate gave us is the first story in Scripture starts with God working and it ends with Him resting. The average human being spends the majority of their days working and sleeping, yet we rarely talk about these two things in the church. And the reason we probably don't give them a lot of airtime is because we don't usually view them as spiritual in nature. Yet, it's interesting that in the creation story, God spent the majority of His time doing these two things. For 6 days He worked, and for 1 day He rested. Which is why we want to look at them from God's perspective during this series as we kind of discern God's blueprint for each of our lives. Take a look at Genesis chapter 1 verse 26. It says this, because God says, "Let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the animals on the earth." And here's something to consider that really is significant. Genesis wasn't the only creation story in the ancient world. There were others, dozens of them, all that were kind of competing against each other. For instance, most of the ancient Babylonian creation myths center around the same idea that the gods are tired and worn out and work is thought of only as a burden. It's kind of beneath them. And so humanity is created as cheap slave labor to do the work for them. That way the gods kind of get to sit back and be at ease. This is what makes the Genesis story so shocking and countercultural is this God, the one true creator God, is nothing like the Babylonian gods. This God doesn't hate work, rather He enjoys it. As such, He doesn't create human beings so He can offload His work onto them, not at all. And it's actually the opposite. God creates humans to share in His image and partner with Him in ruling over creation. God doesn't view humans as savages, He views us as partners. We're not afterthoughts, we're actually the reason why there is a world. Nate put it this way: the reason why God created a world and placed humanity in it was because He wanted us to experience and enjoy His presence. Humanity wasn't created as a cheap slave labor to do His bidding, but rather as His co-creators, His partners. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, we read this, that God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. The writer is clearly trying to emphasize that we, unlike the rest of creation, were created in God's image. Now, what does that mean to be created in the image of God? The word image in Hebrew is the word salim, and it can be translated as idol or statue. An idol is a visible representation of an invisible being. In the ancient world, a statue was put in the pagan temple of every god so the worshipers could see what their god looked like. We are God's statues. We make the visible, give visibility to the invisible God. We show the world what God is like. We are his representatives. Verse 28, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it, rule over it. The birds, the fish, the animals, that's what he's talking about. Now, in our culture, we don't use the word rule, we use the word work. And usually the word work is synonymous with something you have to do rather than something you get to do. In our culture, you work to feed your family, you work to get ahead, you work so that you can retire. John Mark Comer, in his book Garden City, he writes this. He says, the mantra of our culture is that we work to live. The American dream, which started out as a brilliant idea that everybody should have a shot at happy life, has developed over the years into a narcissistic desire to make as much money as possible in as little time as possible with as little effort as possible so that we can get off work and go do something else. But here's the problem. When we stop working, we lose something central to what makes us human. In God's vision for humanity, we don't work to live, we live to work. It is what we were created to do, to rule. When we stop working, we lose a part of what it is that makes us human. And the same is true of rest. When all we do is work day in and day out with no space, no margin, sort of like slaves, we grind our souls down to the bone. We become machines rather than human beings. We were created for both rule and rest, just like God modeled for us in the creation story. And that's what this series is about, how we were designed to rule and rest in partnership with God who created us. So, here's the big takeaways from what Nate shared. Genesis 1 and 2, they provide us with kind of a proper theology for humans. First, that we are the pinnacle of God's creation, made in his image, created to rule over the earth. It's why here at Lake Point we celebrate the beauty of humanity, because we were made in the image of God. We are his representatives who has invited us to rule alongside of him. But here at Lake Point, we don't just celebrate our beauty and potential, we also recognize our shortcomings. And so the kind of second aspect of this is that we were made from the dirt, and due to our fallenness, we can kind of become dirtbags. It's why we need a redeemer. It's why God sent his son into the world. It's why Jesus became a man and lived a perfect life and then went to the cross so that he could redeem humanity of their sin. This is why as Christ followers, we live our lives in allegiance to Jesus. And this is not something we are forced to do. This is something we joyfully do because it's his grace, it's his love and his leadership that gives our lives forgiveness and healing and purpose and meaning and hope and a future. Well, that's week 1, folks. Have fun jumping into discussion questions. We'll see you next time.